A city wall collapses, a conquered town burns, and one of the Bible's most famous battle stories becomes a real archaeological argument in the dust of the Jordan Valley. Jericho is not just any biblical place. It is one of the oldest inhabited sites on Earth, a mound called Tel es-Sultan near modern Jericho in the West Bank. The book of Joshua says that when the Israelites entered Canaan, Jericho was the first great obstacle. The people marched around it, priests blew trumpets, the walls fell, and the city was destroyed. That is the story. But archaeology asks a different question. What can the ground actually show? First, the basic setting. Ancient Jericho sat near a powerful spring, in an oasis below sea level, close to routes leading up into the hill country. Whoever controlled Jericho controlled water, movement, and a gateway into the land. So if Joshua's story has a historical setting, Jericho is exactly the kind of place that would matter. Now the surprise. Excavators really did find collapsed mud brick, burned remains, and storage jars still holding grain. Those details sound at first remarkably close to Joshua 6, where the city falls quickly, is burned, and its goods are not taken as normal plunder. But here's the complication. Archaeology is not only about what happened, it is about when it happened. In the 1930s, British archaeologist John Garstang excavated Jericho and concluded that a violently destroyed city matched the biblical conquest around 1400 BC. For many readers, that seemed like a direct connection. Then, in the 1950s, Kathleen Kenyon used more precise excavation methods. She agreed that Jericho had a major burned destruction layer, but she dated it much earlier, around 1550 BC, at the end of the Middle Bronze Age. In her view, by the time many scholars placed Joshua's conquest, Jericho was not the walled city described in the biblical narrative. That is the heart of the dispute. To understand it, imagine the ancient city as a layer cake. Each generation builds, burns, collapses, levels, and builds again. Archaeologists cut into the mound and read the layers. Pottery is one of their main clocks because styles changed over time. Imported pottery, local jars, scarabs, and later radiocarbon testing all help narrow the date. Kenyon looked especially for late Bronze Age pottery, the kind expected if the city was thriving around 1400 or later. She found very little. That absence mattered. To her, the famous destruction belonged to an earlier Jericho. But not everyone accepted that conclusion. Archaeologist Bryant Wood later argued that Kenyon's dating was too early and that local pottery, scarabs, and the character of the destruction still fit a date around 1400 BC. He also argued that the missing imported pottery may not prove the city was unoccupied, because only limited areas were excavated. Most mainstream archaeologists still side closer to Kenyon's conclusion. The dramatic burned city appears earlier than the usual conquest date. But the debate continues because the evidence is real, the site is complicated, and biblical chronology itself is disputed. Now look at the walls. Jericho had massive fortifications in some periods. The Middle Bronze City had a stone retaining wall with mud brick walls above it. When mud brick collapses, it can tumble outward and form a ramp-like pile. Some have suggested this could explain how attackers entered after a wall collapse. That is an interpretation, not a proven connection to Joshua. And there is another caution. Jericho's most famous ancient tower and wall are much older than Joshua, from the Neolithic period, thousands of years earlier. So when someone says Jericho's walls were found, the first question must be, which walls from which century? The burned destruction layer is powerful evidence for a violent end to one ancient Jericho. Excavators found signs of intense fire. They found jars of grain, which is unusual after a long siege, because grain was valuable and normally consumed or looted. The biblical story says the attack was brief and the city was burned, while ordinary plunder was forbidden. That parallel is interesting. But archaeology cannot tell us that trumpets caused a collapse. It cannot identify Joshua's army in the ash. It cannot prove a miracle. It can only show physical traces, destruction, architecture, pottery, dates, and patterns. So what do we actually know? Fact: Jericho was an ancient fortified settlement in multiple periods. Fact: a major city there was violently destroyed and burned near the end of the Middle Bronze Age. Fact: collapsed mud brick and stored grain have been reported from the site. Interpretation: those details may resemble elements of Joshua 6. Dispute: whether the destruction date can be aligned with the biblical conquest. Unknown: exactly who destroyed that city and whether it relates to the Israelites. That may feel less satisfying than a headline saying Bible proven or Bible disproven, but it is more honest and more interesting. Because Jericho forces us to ask what kind of evidence we expect from the ancient world. A small city destroyed over 3,000 years ago will not preserve a labeled sign saying Joshua was here. And ancient texts are not excavation reports. They tell stories with theology, memory, identity, and meaning. For believers, Jericho can still be a place where faith meets history, not by demanding that every shovel stroke settle the matter, but by recognizing that the Bible's world was real, contested, and buried in recoverable layers. For skeptics, Jericho is not an easy dismissal. There is a destroyed city, there are fallen bricks, there is fire. The argument is not whether ancient Jericho mattered, it is whether this destruction is the destruction Joshua remembers. The strongest payoff is also the most careful one. Jericho gives us evidence of a dramatic collapse and burning, but the date remains the hinge. If the earlier date is right, the ruins may preserve a catastrophe before Joshua's time. If the later interpretation is right, the site becomes one of the most striking archaeological echoes of the conquest story. Either way, the ground beneath Jericho does not leave the story untouched. It sharpens it. If you want more biblical stories tested against texts, artifacts, and disputed evidence without hype, follow Biblical Evidence Files and tell us which site should be opened next: Ai, Hazor, or the Pool of Siloam. Jericho's walls may be famous for falling, but the deeper mystery is why, after a century of digging, they still have not stopped shaking the conversation.